But tonight, it is a great pleasure to be able to introduce to you Ian Morris, a classicist born in Stoke-on-Trent, itself a great classic name in British history. Educated at Cambridge, Birmingham, Chicago. He's now retreated to a readout in the Santa Cruz Mountains in order to teach at Stanford, teach all those Silicon Valley types some history, and we're grateful for that. His early work was in funerary arrangements, the burial customs in ancient history. Usually we like to invite historians who think outside the box to come to the library. He thinks inside the box. Sorry. And in his work, this wonderful series of books he's written on the subject of really the advance, if you can call it that, of civilization, why the West rules for now, the measure of civilization, how social development decides the fate of nations, and now war, what is it good for? Alluding to that great song covered by Bruce Springsteen, which plays a major role in the book, by the way. And he's also a great graphic historian. We like graphic novels in the library, very good for our young adult population. This book and his previous two books on basically the history of civilization and what goes into it are a part of a kind of history sometimes called by Ian Morris in his book, big pattern history. Toynbee, Spengler, Gibbon, Homer, graphic history, Homer Simpson history. Sorry, no, that's not true. But really this book is about, the current book, War, What Is It Good For?, is an argument, a centuries-long argument that was started by Thomas Hobbs in his book Leviathan, which is really the greatest work of political philosophy in English. And it is, what do we do about the war of all against all, the basic aspects of human nature that lead to violence and destruction. And it's Hobbes's argument, defended by Ian Morris in this book, that the state is the creation of our necessity to deal with the war of all against all, and that ultimately the creation of the state, for all the brutality of the state over the centuries, is a good thing, and has led to a decline in violence. And there's statistics that I'm sure he'll go into, which are quite extraordinary about the decline of violence. Steven Pinker, whom he talks about in the book, has recently written about this as well. And there is this argument in the book, an argument that goes on among sociologists and political scientists and historians about how to become Denmark. How we all want to become Denmark, because there's no violence in Denmark. It is a prosperous country. And there is at one point in Ian Morris's book a defense of the European of the dullness of the European Union, and it's because we're all trying to become Denmark, and the European Union is headed in the direction of making everything Denmark. And I do want to say that there could be a problem with this. It may turn out to be that the final death of civilization does not come from acts of violence, but the perfect and undetectable crime of being bored to death. However, Ian Morris's writing is not boring at all. This is brilliant big pattern history. It is an argument that is being taken up in the history profession on many sides. It's an ongoing argument. There are arguments here that go back to Gibbon and that do include Spengler and Toynbee and the rest, and perhaps the most important exponent of big pattern history today is Ian Morris, whom we welcome tonight.
Well, hi, good evening, and thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank you to everyone for inviting me here to the Kansas City Public Library. I spend, breaking the lectern already, spend quite a bit of time hanging around public libraries, and my wife works mostly in adult literacy, and in California, that's based usually in public libraries. But it's a long time since I've been to a public library that seems to be flourishing quite as much as this one. This is really amazing. So thank you so much for coming along this evening. So, okay, yeah, well, I'm going to talk about this new book that was published earlier this month. And as I'm sure everybody will know, I took stole my title mercilessly from the classic 1970 protest song, War, What Is It Good For? Now, you don't have to worry, I'm not about to start singing. I'm going to leave that to the professionals. But in any case, I suspect most of you probably know this song. Most of you probably know the answer that the song gives to that question. Absolutely nothing, says the song. Well, this evening, I find myself in this sort of slightly strange position. I'm here to disagree with the song, at least up to a point anyway. I'm not here to defend war. That's not what I came for. But I do want to disagree with the song a little bit. And the thing is, if you'd invited me 30 years ago, when I was still a college student, there was a serious risk that I would have started singing back in those days. What I really wanted in life was to be a heavy metal guitarist. But what I discovered, to everyone's great relief, I suspect, is that being a historian and an archaeologist came more naturally to me than being a heavy metal guitarist. So I moved careers. But what I've found in the 30 years or so since I've moved careers is that actually being a historian and archaeologist gives you better tools for answering this question than singing in a band does. And so what I want to talk about is basically what I think I've learned about this topic in the last 30 years. But I'm going to start from an extraordinary fact, which was mentioned quickly in the introduction. But this extraordinary fact that has been becoming clearer and clearer across the last couple of decades is that your chance of dying violently has fallen dramatically through history over the last few thousand years. And one of the biggest findings that archaeologists and anthropologists have made across the last 100, 150 years is that Stone Age societies, prehistoric ones and also the ones that survived into the 20th century, Stone Age societies tended to be tinier. Here's a typical example, 19th century Australia. Typically, if a Stone Age person wandered into this room, they would have had a nervous breakdown, seeing so many people all in one place. You'd spend your whole life in a group of a dozen or so people, hardly ever meet up with large groups of people. Now, one consequence of this tiny scale of society was that life was very unstructured. There's not a lot of rules. Everything is worked out in face-to-face interactions. Not a lot of rules and constraints on people. And back in the 19th century, when anthropologists from Europe and America first started writing and studying these societies, they often concluded that the people they encountered were savages. They give you this impression everybody's running around all day long, dawn to dusk, whacking each other in the head with stone axes and killing each other. And now it's pretty clear, well, very clear now, that this is not the case at all. Almost all disputes in Stone Age societies are resolved non-violently. However, if you are a person in a Stone Age society who decides that force will settle your arguments, there are very few constraints on you as compared, say, to you. If you decide to kill the person sitting next to you in this audience, there's a lot of constraints on you. A lot of people are going to come down on you like a ton of bricks. In Stone Age societies, that tends to be much less true. And he's just one famously violent group from South America. But in most Stone Age societies, we find violence gets used to settle disputes a lot more often than we are used to in functioning modern states. And the fighting, the killing, tends to be on a very small scale. It's homicides, it's feuds, it's vendettas. It's not great wars of big battles being fought. But the societies are also very small. And increasingly, it's coming to seem that this sort of steady background noise of violence, it adds up to just staggering rates of violent death. And more anthropologists are saying now, if you were born in the Stone Age, your chance of dying violently is somewhere in the 10 to 20% range. So I'm not sure how many of us are here, but say probably, out of this group, 15 to 30 of us perhaps would die violently, which is just a mind-boggling number. Now, if you fast forward to the 20th century, famously, of course, 2 world wars are fought, genocides are committed, nuclear weapons are used. Somewhere between 100 million and 200 million people died violently in the 20th century. Again, a terrifying number of people. But something like 10 billion people lived during the 20th century. That is a 1 to 2% rate of violent death, a 90% decline from Stone Age figures. Extraordinary change, and it's a great paradox. I mean, we live in the world with the most dangerous weapons ever invented, and yet we have the lowest rate of violent death ever. I mean, how can this be? I mean, and in spite of the horrors, you pick up the newspaper, open up your computer, every day you're hearing terrible things going on in the world, civil war in Syria, terrible stuff happening. Rates of violent death keep falling. This is one of the extraordinary things. And this is a graph, a version of one of the graphs I use in my book. And basically what we're looking at here, just history divided into 3 periods on the bottom axis. The Stone Age over on the left, 20th century in the middle, early 21st century over at the right. On the vertical axis, the percentage chance of any one person dying violently. And then we've got the kind of error bars for the estimates in different periods. The 10 to 20% range over here for the Stone Age, down to 1 to 2% in the 20th century. And according to the United Nations, over here, in the early 21st century, globally, the chance of dying violently is 0.7%, extraordinarily low. This would seem like an enchanted kingdom to people from the Stone Age. So, obvious question, how do we make sure this trend toward a safer world continues in the 21st century, even though we keep getting worse and worse weapons? And it seems to me that in some ways, this is perhaps the most serious question in the world, because if we get it wrong, the consequences don't really bear thinking about. Now, I want to suggest that history, and particularly like long-term history, this big pattern history you were hearing about, that history holds the answer to this question of how we continue this trend. But the problem is, it's, I think, a very uncomfortable answer, and one that I think makes most people feel a bit weird. So I want to suggest that, contrary to what the song says, war actually has been good for something in human history. I mean, not good for everything. I'm not here to defend war, but war has been good for something. Now, obviously, war is mass murder. If there's nothing else we can agree on, we can probably agree on that. What kind of person goes around saying that mass murder has been good for something? And I can confidently tell you this evening, it's the kind of person who's been very surprised by the results of his own research. I would not have guessed 10 years ago that I was going to write a book making this argument. But I think that the evidence of archaeology and anthropology and history, they're very clear when you put them together. That in the long run, and I'm talking about a 10,000-year long run here, so a very long run, that war, for all the horrible, terrible things about war, war has indirectly made the world a safer place. And as I say, this is an uncomfortable argument, a very non-politically correct argument. But I think if we want a safer world, we have to understand what has made the world safer. And one of the things we learn from the history is that we can't just wish war out of existence. Nobody's ever managed that. The reasons why violent death has declined so much are completely different from people just wishing that war would go away. So basically, in this book and this evening, what I want to do, I want to tell you about 4 observations about the history of war that I think we can make from studying the long term. Then I want to say a few words about why does the world work in this peculiar way, and then finally talk about what I think are the implications of this argument. So that's the basic plan for the rest of the evening. So, okay, the first observation I think we can make from looking at the history of war is this really paradoxical claim that what has driven the rate of violent death down across time has ultimately been war itself. Violence has been a sort of self-defeating process. It's just it's taken a very, very long time for violence to defeat itself. But basically, what I think we can see happening is that by fighting 10,000 years of wars, people have created bigger societies by fighting these wars. The societies are more organized, and they've reduced the risk that their members will die violently. And this is, when I sort of make this argument, what I got in mind is actually something that a local boy who I'm sure you will have heard of, Harry Truman, once famously said. Harry Truman said that the definition of a great president is somebody who's right 51% of the time. And I think this is kind of the way to think about this process. That, of course, there are lots of exceptions to what I'm saying. Lots of wars have clearly not produced these bigger, safer societies. But little by little, enough of them have that the world very slowly, across 10,000 years, has moved in the direction of lower rates of violent death. War has been the major motor in driving this process along. And the way it seems to have played out, what happens is that starting about 10,000 years ago, when one society is fighting with another, one group's fighting with another, one group starts winning, increasingly the group that starts winning starts to swallow up the other group, take them over and form a larger society. Once they start doing this, the people who are running these groups find out pretty quickly that if you want to hold these bigger groups together, you've got to have more complex, more efficient forms of government to hold the group together. And they find, particularly, if you want to stay in power in these bigger societies, one of the first things you've got to do is suppress violence within the group itself. Now, people are doing this, the rulers tend to do this, not because they're angels or because they spend all day thinking about the well-being of their subjects, particularly in ancient times. I mean, the guys in charge, I mean, here's some typical guys in charge, Assyrian kings. These are nasty people. They're the masters of violence. This is how they get to be the top people. If they cease to be the masters of violence, somebody who's even more violent will overthrow them. These are not nice people. But that actually is the whole point. They're very cynical people. What they want, they understand that what they need is, like if you are the subjects, what they want is for you to get up every morning and quietly go about your business, working hard and paying taxes so that they can have elaborately woven clothes and perfumed oil to put on their beards and virgins in their harem and all the other things rulers want. That's what they want. What they don't want is you running around being angry, murderous subjects who every time you fall out with the neighboring farmer, you go over there and you kill him, and you burn his home down, and you kill all his cattle. They don't want that. That cuts into the tax take, that makes their job harder. There's like this sort of selective pressure on the rulers to pacify the societies they rule. And on the whole, again, this sort of 51% rule, over the long run, rulers move their societies in this direction. Because if they don't, they tend to get put out of business by other rulers who have moved their societies in that direction. There's pressure on them. Now, of course, again, lots of exceptions to this rule. In the book, I talk about this as the what about Hitler problem. I mean, Hitler does not fit this generalization. And there's no shortage of mad dictators. I mean, here's a little sampling. You take your pick. Stalin, Mao, Idi Amin, no end of these guys. Plenty of exceptions. But the thing is, of course, picking out the exceptional cases is never going to prove anything about the big trend. In spite of the extreme cases of the really bad genocidal rulers, over the long run, this pattern seems to be unmistakable, this 90% fall in rates of violent death. It took 10,000 years, but we're now 10 times less likely to die violently than we would have been in the Stone Age. So that's the first observation I would make, the biggest observation in the book, biggest claim. Second observation, though, I think we can actually go a little further than this. Not only has war indirectly made the world safer, it's also, even more indirectly, made the world more prosperous, the second of these observations. And again, great paradox. You know, war is killing people and destroying things. That's what war is about. And yet it seems to have led to less killing and more not destroyed things. And I think, again, big paradox. What we see, same pattern repeated over and over again in history, that when these bigger societies get formed, you get a period of conquest, the Roman Empire, the Han Dynasty in China, whoever you look at. Conquest where rates of violent death spike way up, there's terrible slaughters and massacres. But then if you come back a century or two later, what you find is that everyone involved, the conquerors and the conquered, tend to be better off after a couple of centuries. They've formed a bigger society, it's more peaceful than it was before the conquest, and the trade routes have become more elaborated. The division of labor has increased. Indirectly, by creating a more peaceful world, war drove this process, leading to the world becoming more prosperous too. Again, a great paradox, I think, running right through history. Now, this obviously is a scant consolation to the people living through the wars, that this has been the long-term consequence. But I think that the third claim, the third observation I make in my book, is probably wins the competition for the most depressing claim in the book out of all of them. War, I think, is the worst possible way to create larger and safer societies. But when you look at history, it seems to be the third claim pretty much the only way people have found to do this. So as I say, very depressing claim to make. But again, I think the evidence is quite clear that people very rarely give up the right to settle their problems through force unless they're forced to do that by somebody who applies even greater force. And that, I think, is a pretty good generalization. Obviously, there must be exceptions across 10,000 years of history, but I've had trouble finding them. And the obvious exceptions, like the European Union, say the early history of the US Republic, a lot of the dynastic marriages in Europe where kingdoms are brought together, over and over again, they all turn out to depend on force in one way or another. To make this work, somebody has to have a monopoly on force. So I want to be clear about what I'm saying. I'm not saying that democracy and commerce and the peace movement and soft power generally are irrelevant to the process of making the world a safer place. Obviously, they're not. But I think what you see from the big picture is that all of these are kind of secondary phenomena. They all depend on war having produced governments that make peace, and in a sense, governments that make it safe enough for this soft power to operate. That is what I think is driving things along. Well, as you're hearing in the introduction, these three observations, they've all got deep roots. I'm hardly the first person to suggested any of these things. And the guy they are normally tied to varying degrees, the three claims, are normally tied back to this character here, Thomas Hobbes, who wrote Leviathan back in 1651. Hobbes was an Englishman, lived through the English Civil War. The country is falling apart. 100,000 of his fellow countrymen are killed in this civil war. Hobbes flees overseas, and he's thinking, how did this happen? What happened to the world? And he realizes, it seems to him that what has happened is that central government collapsed in England. That led to groups of people saying, we can use force to get what we want. We don't have to worry about the government coming along and throwing us in jail or executing us. We can use force to get what we want. The only thing, Hobbes concludes, that keeps people from resorting to force to settle their problems is what he called Leviathan. And Leviathan, I'm sure many of you will know, is a really scary monster in the book of Job in the Old Testament. And he says, the only thing that scares people straight is having a government as terrifying as Leviathan. When you've got that, then people will stop using violence. And he says, back in ancient times, before you had these governments, famously he says, the life of man was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. He said, people were constantly feuding, fighting the war of all against all. Only Leviathan, he suggested, could improve this situation. Now, back when Hobbes was writing in the 1600s, Hobbes had basically no evidence for making these claims. And Hobbes, super smart guy, but actually he really wasn't interested in evidence. A lot of his writing was about physics, and he was living in the golden age of physics experiments, of Boyle and Newton theorizing away. But all these people, within a few miles of where he was writing in England, were doing all these physics experiments that established the basic laws of physics. He never went to visit any of them, had no interest in actual concrete evidence. Hobbes was a lot smarter than most of us today are, but Hobbes got to his conclusion just by reasoning and speculation. I think that what we can now do is bring some evidence to bear. I think we are now in a position to prove that Hobbes was right in a lot of his claims. Okay, so if those three claims are right, then I think we have to conclude that war has been good for something. Obviously not good for everything. War has been good for some very specific things. It's been the only way people have found to create larger, more organized societies that drive down the rates of violent death and indirectly make people richer. And in fact, the fourth observation, the fourth claim I make in my book, is that in the long run, war has been so good at doing this that the final claim is that war is now putting itself out of business. And I think this, again, in a way, is sort of a paradoxical claim to make. I think if you're a space alien, you came to Earth and you had like total recall of all of human history, you looked at this long-term pattern, I think what you would probably conclude is that, well, that the direction of history seems to be like this, what the world is going to get is one more great war which will create a world government and then drive rates of violent death down towards zero, most prosperous world ever. However, what you would also figure out, because you're a really clever space alien, is that humans have now got so good at fighting, with weapons so terrible, organizations so efficient, that, of course, such a great war creating a world government has become impossible for obvious reasons. Another great war would potentially kill absolutely everybody. Violence has eventually started to become self-defeating. And I think you would find lots of evidence to suggest to you as a space alien that this is the direction the world is going in. Back in 1986, which was the year that Bruce Springsteen released his cover version of the song War, 1986 was the peak year for nuclear weapons in the world. There were 70,000 nuclear warheads in the world at that point. The war games that the Department of Defense in the US ran to try to get a sense of what's going to happen if the worst case scenario comes about estimated 1 billion dead in the first month of a total war. They couldn't estimate how many more hundreds of millions would die in the following months, possibly everybody on Earth. That was the situation back in 1986. For every 20 nuclear warheads in the world then, there is now one. And this is maybe the happiest graph in the world, the chart of the number of nuclear warheads in the world. We can no longer annihilate ourselves in the space of a couple of weeks, and that has got to be good news. Okay, so those are the 4 big observations that I try to make in my book. And the book basically tells the story across 10,000 years of this decline in rates of violent death. And it's an unsettling story. It's a messy, complicated story, as these things always are as well. Lots of twists and turns. But just to boil it down to, I think, the basic elements, I think there's really 3 stages in this story that we can tell. And the first of them goes from, say, roughly 10,000 BC down to, say, for a nice round number, 1 BC. And the period sees the rise of bigger and bigger empires. By 1 BC, you've got the Roman Empire, the Mauryan Empire in India, they've got the Han Chinese Empire out in China. Across this period, it's hard to put very precise numbers on rates of violent death, but the estimates I make are that by this period, which is, where's my point? Here it is. By this period, this middle column here, the time of ancient empires, rates of violent death have fallen by something like 3/4 since the Stone Age. A lot of the really heavy lifting has already been done by then. So that's the first big phase, the ancient decline in violence. Second phase, though, is particularly in the old world, from, say, the Mediterranean over to China, where something like 90% of the world's population lives in this period. Rates of violent death then spike back up again. I'm starting somewhere around about AD 200. Oops, that was not it. Oh, there it is. So this is now, you see, the ancient decline, then a medieval spike back up in rates of violent death. And we're talking here basically about the period that is sort of sandwiched between Attila the Hun and Genghis Khan. I mean, obviously using those guys as our beginning and end points gives you a sense of the kind of thing we're talking about here. These are not nice people. And this is a period when, in the old world, cavalry coming out of the steppes, the great band of grasslands that runs from Manchuria to Hungary, the kind of thing you see down here. This is Manchuria in East Asia down here. Cavalry coming out of these steppes overwhelmed the great agricultural empires who cannot deal with these cavalry. Central governments break down in the face of external aggression that they just can't cope with. Noblemen within these societies become stronger than the rulers. The societies break down over and over again into anarchy and violence. So great breakdown, great spike in rates of violent death. Rates of violent death perhaps double during this period, from about AD 200 to 1400. Now, at this point, I actually want to break the story for just a second and get all professorial on you. I want to say a couple of words about causation, about how things tie together, and then I'm going to come back to the story in just a second. I think this period, this medieval spike up in rates of violent death, I think it's really important because it reveals 2 big things about the story. And one is, I think, a very obvious point, but one worth making all the same, that not all wars contribute to this long-term trend of driving down rates of violent death. death. And for more than a millennium, we get, in fact, the exact opposite happening. Instead of leading indirectly to the formation of bigger, safer, ultimately richer societies, these wars tend to lead to the breakdown of such societies. You get smaller, more violent and poorer societies. And this slightly headache-inducing graph shows you what I'm talking about here. What we're looking at here, this spaghetti mess of multicolored lines, the blue, red, yellow and green lines show you the size. Actually, along the bottom we've got dates from 1 AD to 1400. On the vertical axis, we've got the area of the largest states within Europe, the Middle East, China and India, measured in square kilometers. And you see these lines going all over the place. These invasions, civil wars cause the recreation breakdown of different states. The purple line, though, is a regression line plotted through all this chaos of numbers, showing you what the overall trend is. It's a steady downward trend across this period in the size of states, and that seems to be mapped pretty well by the levels of violence. So as the societies break down and get smaller and smaller, less and less organized, the levels of violence go up and up. So this second phase, I think, is very important for reinforcing this point that not all wars have this positive long-term effect. This phase is ended, though, around about 1400. This sort of general sort of counterproductive wars. This gets ended when guns start to become so effective that they can be used to close down the nomads riding around on the steppes. Guns shut down their migrations and begin to make it safe for much bigger states to start growing up again. The Europeans perfect these guns and then combine them with ships and start exporting violence around the world after about 1500. And I suggest in my book that we can actually think of a kind of 500 years war that Europe wages on the rest of the world. And by the end of this, by the beginning of the 20th century, Europeans and their colonists, like Americans, Australians and so on, Europeans and their colonists rule 84% of the surface of the world. They brought almost the entire planet under their control. Rates of violent death have been driven down lower than they've ever been before. So that's one way in which I think this medieval spike in violence is important. The second way in which I think it's really important to the story is that it helps us figure out the causation, what drives what. There's increasing agreement on what some of the big outlines of the story in violence are, but not much agreement among what is cause and what is effect here. And the reason I think there's been so much disagreement is that nearly all the studies that have been done, I go back to this graph here, the different periods, the rates of violent death, nearly all the studies that have been done just focus on this end here, from say about 1500 to 2000, and just normally tend to look at Europe and North America. And if you do that, what you see is one phenomenon, one decline in violence. Some people like Steven Pinker in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, or Jared Diamond in his recent book, The World Until Yesterday, they look at this period here, but then also look back at the Stone Age, but generally tend to ignore the ancient world. And again, if you include the Stone Age, again, you see a steady decline in violence. The problem with just looking at it that way is you've only got one case to think about, which makes it very hard to isolate cause and effect when you've just got one case study. Once you see that the modern decline in violence is not the only time this has happened. It's happened once before, this ancient decline and then the medieval spike. Now we've got three periods to compare: the ancient decline, the medieval rise, the modern decline. When you do that, you can compare and contrast these cases and begin to ask, is there anything that runs across all three of these cases? And only one factor does: the wars that either create bigger societies or break them down. That's what runs across all the cases. And that's basically why I suggest that the ultimate cause of this decline in rates of violent death has been war itself. Okay, well, I could happily go on all night about the history and the details, but I will spare you that. I think the obvious question you might want to ask is, well, if this is true, why does the world work in this unpleasant way? Why is the world like this? And I think to answer that question, you've got to go beyond this 15,000-year long-term history. That is still not looking at enough of the world. What you need to do is go to a 3.8 billion year history, the history of the evolution, the biological evolution of violence, which is something where our picture of this has changed out of all recognition, particularly by comparing humans with our closest genetic kin, the other great apes. And 50 years ago, this was pretty much impossible to do. At that point, almost nobody was studying the great apes in their natural settings in Africa. The first person to do this was Jane Goodall, who back in the early 1960s set up the Gombe Research Park in Tanzania. One of the things that pretty much all biologists will now agree on is that almost every species of animals uses violence in some way. Every species is different, but almost all of them use violence in some way. And the obvious conclusion to draw from that is that violence is an evolved adaptation. Animals would not have evolved to behave this way unless there was some payoff from using the violence. And the way biologists normally try to explain this is they'll say, well, each species of animals uses violence in a different way. So lambs and lions, they both use violence, but in very, very different ways. And what has happened is that each species has evolved toward an equilibrium, a kind of sweet spot, if you like, in the amount of violence they use and the forms of violence they use. And what happens is, I mean, say we're a room full of lions, and say some of you, say this lady in the front row here is a particularly violent lion, and every other lion you meet, you attack them. You don't think, you just attack them. Well, what's going to happen? Pretty obvious what's going to happen. You, even if you're a really good fighter, you are going to get hurt sooner rather than later. You're going to get injured because you fight too much. You are less likely to pass your genes on to the next generation than the average lion will be. Or say the gentleman sitting next to her, say you are a pacifist lion. You will never, ever fight other lions. You've got the same problem, but of course in the mirror image. You're not going to get knocked out of the gene pool by being killed in a fight, but you're not going to get access to as much food as the other lion, the average lion. You're not going to get access to as many mates as the average lion. And so every lion is different from every other lion, but they have evolved toward a kind of equilibrium average use of violence, which is determined by their attributes, their strength and their speed and their fierceness and so on, the predators they have to compete with, the prey that they're feeding on. Lambs, of course, entirely different animals, but the same deal. You know, some are too violent, some are not violent enough. Each species evolves toward this sort of equilibrium use of violence. Now, we are just the same. We are animals. This is what has happened with us. The equilibrium use of violence for humans was this 10 to 20% rate of violent death we get in the Stone Age, which we've been doing for many, many thousands of years. We, just like other animals, we have evolved. We evolved into our modern form around the edge of the Central African rainforest, where the other great apes are. About 100,000 years ago, we start to be basically the same animals. Now, we are exactly the same as every other species of animals in the world, except for the fact that we are completely different from every other species in the world. This is where I think the problems begin with understanding what goes on. Biological evolution produced us, and it produced the miracle of nature, which each of you, conveniently for me, has brought along with you this evening to the Kansas City Public Library. At the top end of your body, you have brought 2.7 pounds of pulsating hot energy, sugar and liquids and other stuff slopping around in your skulls, the human brain. There's nothing else like it in the world. So far as we know, there's nothing of this complexity in the entire universe, so far as we know. Biological evolution produced this. But now that we've got one of these each, this allows us not just to evolve biologically. So like other animals, as their environment changes, the animal gradually starts changing into a new animal. They respond to the changing environment. Different genetic balances are more successful or less successful. We do that too. But we also evolve culturally. So as the payoffs from different kinds of behavior change in the world around us, we not only evolve biologically through having sex and having babies and mutating and so on, we can also change our institutions and our cultures and our values and our patterns of behavior. We can change them to respond to the payoffs from the world around us. No other animal can do this, with a few marginal exceptions. Basically, no other animal can do this. Now, that's why rates of violent death have come down by 90% across the last 10,000 years, even though we're still basically the same animal we were 10,000 years ago. Stronger governments, as these wars get fought, creating bigger societies that have stronger governments that suppress violence within the community, people have responded to this. They've realized that violence doesn't pay. We've internalized this. It's become more and more of an instinct. Violence doesn't pay. We don't use as much violence. We can't wish war away. Just saying war is terrible, that doesn't ever seem to have accomplished anything. But the good news is we are really good at responding to these changes in the environment. Now, if this is right, then I think there is one big lesson to draw from the history of violence. And that is the one thing that has really driven down the rates of violence is the growth of Leviathan, these big, strong, scary governments that basically have scared us straight. Okay, well, to start moving this toward a conclusion, to wrap things up. If this is a correct understanding of the shape of history, and obviously you will have to be the judges of that, if this is a correct understanding, are there lessons we can learn from history? Is there something this can tell us about our world? And I think the answer is yes. If we understand the big trends and what has driven them, then I think we should be able to learn something from the past. And to explain what I think are the big lessons, I want to pick up the sort of historical story where I left it off a few minutes ago, when I was talking about Europeans waging this 500 years war on the world, starting to swallow up more and more of the world from roughly 1500 onward. By the 18th century, by about 1750, Europeans have started to build up vast empires around the world. Here you see some of the big ones around 1750 in different colours, taking over bits of the coastline of different continents, vast intercontinental empires. So vast, spanning so much of the world. This is what Adam Smith, the famous philosopher, sees in 1776 in his Wealth of Nations. Smith starts to see that the world is changing. As the Leviathans get bigger and bigger and bigger, the world is changing. In the old days, says Smith, the source of the wealth of nations was basically conquest and plunder and then taxing the people that you brought into your empires, like the Romans, the Han, the Marians. Bring people into your empires, tax them. Well, says Smith in the 18th century, in the modern world, this is no longer the true source of the wealth of nations. The real source of the wealth of nations is people being left free to truck and barter, which he says is the natural inclination of humans. He says if governments just leave people alone to get on with trading with each other in markets, the markets will get bigger and bigger, more and more productive. The government doesn't need to conquer and plunder people. It just needs to oversee these markets, tax the markets, draw its revenue from them. The governments will be much, much richer than they ever used to be in the old days. Now, of course, this is a very famous insight. What Smith is normally remembered for is this insight that markets work best when governments get out of them. But he also had something else he was saying in The Wealth of Nations, which I think people often nowadays tend to forget. He says, markets work best when governments get out of them. But he also says markets can only work at all when governments get into them. And what he meant by that is that the government has to perform, the Leviathan has to perform this task of like policing these markets. It has to stop the bully, stop the guy who shows up with a gun at your fruit stall and takes all the money you've made that day. Government has to be there intervening in these markets, otherwise they can't work at all. And what he sees pretty quickly is that what the world needs now is not Leviathans, like Spain protecting its empire, Britain protecting its empire. He says what the world needs is a kind of super Leviathan, a kind of Globocop, somebody who will try to police these flows of global trade in a fairly impartial way so the markets can get bigger and bigger and bigger. And he writes this in The Wealth of Nations, which, as I say, comes out in 1776. And he has this famous line in that. He says, I know this is a really stupid idea. Nobody's ever going to do this. But if the British government would just leave the Americans alone to truck and barter, everybody will be so much better off. But he says, but of course, there's no possibility of that ever happening. I mean, the British are never going to give up their colonies. And of course, in 1776, the Americans decide to spare the British the trouble of having to make this decision by rebelling against them. And this becomes like this test case of the Smith argument. And Britain loses its colonies. All the British are saying, oh my God, the empire is it's disaster, disaster. By 1789, British trade with America is higher than it has ever been before. Smith has proved absolutely right. The British Empire oversees these sea lanes. It doesn't need to rule America anymore. What the world needs, says Smith, is this sort of super Leviathan. And this is basically what the world gets. After about 1815, after the defeat of Napoleon, Britain is the only industrialized power in the world. It bestrides the globe like a colossus, basically. And the 19th century, of course, sees all kinds of terrible wars. The American Civil War is just an obvious case. Extreme brutality in the European colonial conquest. And the most famous extreme case, of course, is the Congo in Central Africa. I apologize for showing you quite such a graphic picture, but I thought actually maybe it is worth putting this up, because when you're talking about these big global trends, it's easy to forget that what we are actually talking about here is acts of extreme brutality and violence, of which the Belgian Congo is perhaps the worst on record. So there's these terrible things going on. But the overall result in the 19th century is that the world gets tied together more than ever before. Rates of violent death go down lower than ever before. Global wealth everywhere in the world. By the end of the 19th century, per capita wealth is beginning to increase. Now, obviously, it increases most in Europe and North America, increases particularly in Britain. And Britain is making its money in this new world order by selling its goods and services overseas. Polices these open markets and sea lanes so that it can do this, but it finds it's got this sort of slightly weird problem, that if it's going to be a prosperous nation by selling goods and services overseas, what it needs is prosperous foreigners. People have got to be able to afford to buy your stuff, otherwise none of this is going to work very well. And the British get in this weird situation where they are encouraging other countries to industrialize and get richer. British capital funds industrial revolutions, particularly in Germany and the US. British experts go and hire themselves out to advise on this. British machine makers sell machines to Americans and Germans to make goods that can then undercut British goods in the market. And this begins to become a problem. It turns out this is an economic triumph for Britain, which just gets richer and richer. But it's kind of a strategic disaster. By the 1870s, I should apologize actually for showing you quite so many graphs, but perhaps after the last picture, this graph will be a welcome relief. By the 1870s, what we're looking at here, dates along the bottom, gross domestic product per person measured in billions, gross domestic product of different nations measured in billions of dollars, fixed at a 1990 value to allow for inflation, and different countries with different colored lines on this graph. By the 1870s, which is where are we, say somewhere around here, what the British are realizing is basically Britain has become so rich by helping the US and Germany and other places industrialize, but in doing so, it's created its own rivals. It's like the more successful Britain is at being Globocop, the harder the job becomes to do. Because it's now got these rivals. And in the 1870s, when this pattern becomes clear, nobody actually challenges British globocopery. Nobody is silly enough to do that. 40 years on, though, by the time we get over here in the 1910s, and we see where the US is at this point, it's becoming clear to a lot of people that Britain is no longer in a position to raise the costs from using force to settle problems. And it's not like people are looking for war in the 1910s, but there's some factions, particularly a faction within the German government, that starts saying, hey, our strategic problems are horrible. Here we are, sandwiched between Russia and France. Maybe war is no longer the worst possible option for us. Maybe violence will actually solve our problems. And of course, the result, as we all know, is that the 20th century is dominated by these massive wars. Now, the reason I tell you all that, since 1989, a lot of people see some slightly alarming similarities between the kind of world the United States has built up since 1989 and the old British Empire. I mean, huge differences, of course, too, but some rather striking similarities. American wealth, like 19th century British wealth, depends on global trade. The United States, even more than the British ever did, the United States has this massive, overwhelming preponderance of force and money, and polices these global trade routes. It encourages other countries to get richer to trade with America. And China, of course, is the classic example of this. And since about 2000, more and more people have started saying, well, this is kind of a rerun of the old story. The US and China have made each other rich, but the US has begun to create a potential rival here. Now, in the 2000s, of course, pretty much nobody directly challenged the US order with violence, just like nobody challenged the British in the 1870s. But if the current trends continue, I think it's not scaremongering to suggest that in 40 years' time, the US might not any longer be able to raise the costs of using force enough to put off everybody. By the 2040s, we may be in a world, once again, where some governments are ready to risk violence. And some would say, because we're already entering such a world, with Vladimir Putin as the #1 example of this. But if this is what's happening, we're rerunning the old script, then I think we get the worst of all possible worlds out of this. We get a world as unstable as the run-up to World War I, combined with weapons even worse than those of the Cold War. And here is, I think, a sign of the shape of things to come. This is a robotic plane. Last year, for the first time ever, a robot plane landed itself on the deck of an aircraft carrier and then took off again. And as many of you will know, I'm sure, this is the most difficult task the US Navy asks any of its flyers to do, is land and take off from aircraft carriers. We now have robots that can do this without any human input. We are entering one of the fastest periods of change in weaponry the world has ever seen. And it suggests to me that the next 40 years are likely to be the most dangerous in history. Now, okay, the lesson of history then, I would say, is that peace and prosperity depend on having a Leviathan or nowadays a Globocop. If we want a safer, richer world, we need to keep a Globocop. And frankly, in the world we live in, the only possible applicant for the job is, of course, the United States. I think the alternative to that, a breakdown of the system, means a rerun of the script that led up to World War I, but this time with nuclear weapons. Now, okay, to closing question. Can that go on forever? I mean, can we avoid a stable world order? Can we avoid the breakdown of a stable world order forever and ever? Well, I think you just have to ask the question to realize the answer, of course, is no. I mean, nothing has ever gone on forever in the past. It's a little optimistic to think that all of a sudden something will now start going on forever. Does that mean that we're all doomed? Well, I have some thoughts on that too, but I've talked quite a lot. So for those, you're going to have to read the book. So thank you for coming along this evening. Thank you. Oh, of course, yes.
Of course, we'll take questions, and maybe you could repeat the question because we don't have a microphone.
Sure, yes, I'll shout
I just want to
out.
remind people that Barnes & Noble has a book for sale outside, and you are required to buy one before you leave.
So should I just victimize members of the audience myself? Okay, a gentleman here in the middle.
Could you say that the perpetrators of violence are creating this, or the survivors of violence?
So the question was, would I say that the perpetrators of violence, or we say the perpetrators of violence are creating this? Did you mean like the decline in rates of violence?
Yeah, my perception is it's those who survive that are reducing violence.
Mm-hmm. Right, yes, so the question was, would I say that it's the perpetrators of violence that are driving this process of pacification, or the survivors of violence? And I guess I'd say, I mean, it's a sort of depressing thing to say, but it's the combination. It's everybody working together. That if... I mean, it's sort of an impossible thing to imagine, I guess, really, but if people back in the Stone Age had not wage these struggles with each other, that they settle by violence, leading to the creation of these bigger societies, then we would still be living in a Stone Age world with very, very high rates of violent death. So in a way, it's driven by people deciding to use violence to settle their problems. But of course, in another way, you're absolutely right. It's the survivors, the winners of these struggles. They're the ones who actually take the steps that lead to the creation of these larger, more peaceful societies. And because the ideal solution would be if people were able consistently to sit down and talk over their problems and say, hey, we're all running around in these little groups and it's just kind of a nightmare. Why don't we put aside our differences, come together, form a larger community, put some people in charge, we can have an election and turf them out next year, we'll have bigger trade routes, everything will be great. If humanity had been able to do that, then we could have had all of the benefits without all these costs. And I think, and I sort of alluded to this in the talk, the depressing thing about history, I think, is how you see that it's just really hard to find examples of people doing this. That I think that the core problem is that because, and this is where I think the biology comes in, that because we are capable of using violence, that it's always there as a possibility. And some people may decide to turn to violence, and in the long run of history, that has consistently been the case. So that I think is sort of the depressing result. A gentleman near the back there, yeah.
Yeah, you expressed the idea that in our modern times that violence was now seen as being self-defeating. Now this view, is it only from the ruling class without the input of the common people?
Yeah, so the question was about what I was saying about how violence is sort of becoming self-defeating, and people are starting to say the payoffs from violence make it not worth doing. And correct me if I start mangling your question, just turning it into what I want to answer. I have a bad habit of doing that. So the question was, is this just the perspective of the ruling class, or is this something that ordinary people say the same kind of thing as well? And I guess, I hope this doesn't turn into my answer to every question tonight, but again, I would say sort of a little bit of both, I think. That certainly, in a way, the big driver has been the ruling classes, particularly in the Cold War, the ruling groups in the Soviet Union and the United States. The Cold War ends, basically it ends because enough of the leadership in the Soviet Union say, we got these terrible problems and force is not going to solve them. We realize that invading West Germany is not going to solve the problems the Soviet Union has in the late 1980s. And Gorbachev and the group around him look at the problem and say, stepping back from Eastern Europe, giving that up, this is going to be a disaster. But compared to the alternatives, we're just going to have to do that. So I think it is sort of driven from the top down. On the other hand, I think it's also, of course, it wouldn't be happening were it not for massive input from the whole of society. And I think, again, it's a sort of the feedback between the two. And so you say, I don't want to go on about this one question all night, but say, obviously, you take a country like the US, there's huge variation from place to place in the levels of violence you get in different places. And like, say, I used to live on the south side of Chicago, and on the south side, there was quite a lot of violence. I mean, not compared to some parts of the world, but compared to most of the US, there's quite a lot of violence. And it always seemed to me that part of what was going on there was just that this sort of machinery of the state that you had operating in most of the country, that people felt reasonably confident that if something happens, you pick up the phone and the cops are going to come and things will sort of get sorted out. Just a lot of people on the south side did not feel that way. And often, I think, kind of rightly, that it was like the government apparatus just wasn't penetrating everywhere. So I guess I would say, again, it's this sort of back and forth between the two, perhaps. Well, lots of hands. Gentleman standing up near the back.
Research, did you find, a lot of people think war is driven by money. What did you find in your research?
Right.
Especially now.
Yeah.
Blaming the politicians to go to war because it's a money machine.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So is war driven by money? And I think, particularly if we sort of widen the question a little bit from just money to sort of material needs more generally, I'd say that on the whole, I think that is true. That most wars in history have been about something fairly concrete. And what the anthropologists will tell you is, if you look at war in contemporary Stone Age societies, what you find is actually people can go to war over almost anything. And in fact, the things that they tend to fight over are very similar to what young men within almost every society fight over. Sex is the number one thing. Men fight over women. And I should say, I mean, another interesting thing I learned, if you look at police records from almost anywhere in the world, you find that 90 to 95% of the violence is committed by young men aged between about 15 and 30. This is true across the entire planet. That is also true of chimpanzees. Overwhelmingly young guys. Sex is the number one thing they fight over. The number two thing is prestige. And the evolutionists will say, well, that's because the prestige is so tightly linked to the sex, that the high status males tend to get more access to reproductive mates, and so they are more likely to pass their genetic material on to the next generation. So it's a kind of self-reinforcing thing. But I think when you look at the records of wars of more complex societies, I mean, obviously there have been wars, plenty of wars about sex. I mean, Helen of Troy, obvious example. But increasingly, I think as you go on through time, you find they're driven by what nowadays we think of as more, it's a horrible way to say it, but more sensible material forces. And yeah, I mean, a lot of the time it is all about resources, about oil, it's about money, it's about diamonds. These are the things that drive people to war. And again, I mean, sort of, in a way, I think that the story I'm telling in this book is kind of an uplifting story, because I think that the direction of the story is toward an increasingly peaceful and prosperous world. But it does have all these depressing things about it. And one of the depressing things is that it seems that it doesn't actually matter how base and despicable the motives are of the people who start the wars. That sort of doesn't seem to matter very much for whether the war ends up producing a safer and more prosperous world. The wars that the Europeans waged and everybody else were among the most despicable ever fought, and yet they have this weird result of producing, in the end, indirectly a less violent world. It's a weird thing. But, yeah, a lady over here. Oh.
Yeah, my question is, do you make any distinction in your book between war and war fatigue? Because what I find here is that a lot of the good things that come from war is not actually from war, it's from war fatigue. And if you look at Europe, European wars, for example, I don't think the Frenchmen have been okay, all, clapping, praising Napoleon in his conquest. But after Waterloo, they were not so eager.
Yeah.
Same thing with Germans, they were not so eager after Stalingrad and after failing to find Zealand. Today you can say in America, they're not so eager to support
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
So you always have those small periods, post-war periods, 2 years or so, when people really begin to draw back, to just really reflect. And in result of that, we start creating a peaceful environment that would have been even better than pre-war stage. But that mean we needed a war together.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. The question is about a distinction between war and war fatigue, and perhaps one of the big things driving pacification is not so much the kind of process I'm talking about here, but just people getting sick of the fighting and the violence. Is that sort of more close enough to your question? Okay, close enough. Yeah, and I think this is something I did actually think about a little bit, and. I guess I would agree with what you're saying up to a point, that I think the war fatigue can be a powerful force for peace if everybody involved feels war fatigue. And like when I was growing up in Britain in the 60s and 70s, this was during the period of the troubles in Northern Ireland, the struggle with the IRA and all the killings going on there. And I always felt that one of the big lessons there was that the only way that could get ended was when we got to a point that, I was going to say both sides in the struggle, there's actually, as usual, multiple groups involved, but all the sides in the struggle concluded violence is not going to solve our problems anymore. So long as even one group carries on saying, yeah, maybe it will, maybe killing a few more people will actually get us what we want, you're not going to get peace while there's even one group that's still thinking that way. And eventually by the late 90s, you are starting to get to the point that nobody thinks they can solve this with force anymore. And I guess I feel sort of the same way about some of the Middle Eastern struggles at the moment, that until we get to the point that the Israelis and the Palestinians and the other Arab nations and everybody else has got a finger in the pie, till we get to the point that everybody says, yeah, just violence is just not going to solve this, we're not going to see peace there. So yeah, I would definitely agree with the war fatigue thing, but I think it has to be everybody involved in this. So do you want to go ahead with the question you were going to ask? Or? Okay, gentleman in the back.
You don't ever look forward to a day when the United States is not at war, do you?
Sorry, pardon? Could you repeat the question? Oh, could you repeat the question?
You don't look forward to a day when we're never kicking someone's door in. I think we're pretty aggressive.
Yeah, because that is the outcome. I think almost everybody would like most is a day when there's no more wars being fought at all. And I guess it seems to me that what the history seems to show is the only way we found in the past to reduce the number of wars has been for there to be somebody who's scary enough that other governments are, particularly the governments then, because it percolates all the way down, are saying war is not going to solve our problems. And I mean, this is something I thought about while I was writing the book, but then ended up not really talking about all that much. It's kind of the assumption running through what I'm saying is that we get to a point where there's one big player, one globocop on the block, and that scares everybody else off from making trouble. Because this only holds if the globocop itself prefers not to fight wars. And because one interesting way to think about this is, well, what if Hitler wins World War II? Which I think is ultimately, I mean, if you think about Hitler winning World War II in the sense of defeating the Soviets or defeating Britain, I think both of those things were perfectly possible. If you think of him winning World War II in the sense of conquering the entire planet and defeating the US, that I think is way less likely to have happened. But I guess it's perfectly conceivable that we could have a world dominated by an absolutely tyrannical government which would not make the world safer at all. I don't think that's a very likely outcome. But yeah, I mean, I guess I do look forward to a day when the US will not be going around kicking everybody's ass. So that would be good. Yes, gentleman here.
Yes, sir. I did a thesis on federal troops and riots in
Ah.
history. And I noticed that most of the deployment of federal troops in domestic disturbances were either during or right after a war. There was the New York draft riots in
Oh.
1963, many incidents in 1991. World War II there was 2 or 3, and in the 60s many. Federal troops and riots. And I kind of followed up on that a little bit. I didn't do the same kind of in-depth research you did, but it doesn't seem to me that during wartime, violent crime domestically goes up. Now that kind of, I'm not, contradicting what you're saying there, but I didn't do quite the research you did, and I certainly claim I did, but I did get sort of the impression that obviously a riot that crawls in federal military forces to back up the National Guard or police is pretty bad by nature. The fact that so many of those incidents were during the war and after the war, and when veterans come home from the wars, typically it was a spike in crime. How does that kind of, I mean, that's a minor thing. I know you're a big picture historian, it's a minor, sort of, but isn't that a bit of a deal where violence is considered okay for the state? Individuals might conclude it's okay for, if I have a problem with Johnny Johnson over here, I might want to settle it the same way the state settles violence. But it did seem to me that violence went up during and after, and more importantly, immediately after the war concluded. How does, again, I don't want to throw my research out there against yours because you did more work than I did by far, but how does that play?
Right. Yeah, well, the gentleman was telling us he's done some research on the use of federal troops within the US to sort of suppress disorder and so on. And one of the things he found was that the violence tends to go up in sync with the wars that the US is fighting overseas. So like the draft riots in the Civil War, and then say the 1960s disturbances in US cities. And that's a really interesting point. I mean, that's something in the US case, I had never thought about. But right, yeah, but what you're saying actually, doesn't surprise me particularly, because I think we see that in a lot of other cases too. That I think, again, one of the paradoxes of this story is that while these while the fighting and the process of creating these bigger organizations is going on, violence tends to go up, and it tends to go up across the board. And we see something very, very similar actually in ancient Roman times, in the 1st century BC, the height of the wars the Romans are fighting, expanding their empire, bringing all these other people into the empire. It also coincides with a great spike in violence back in Rome. And things just, I mean, they go way beyond anything the US saw in the 1960s. You get to the point where, like the elected consuls out of the Roman Senate, one of these consuls, he gets elected to office. I forget the exact year now. It's the middle of the 1st century BC. He gets elected to office, and one of his rivals doesn't want him in the office, so he says, okay, we're not going to let him come to the forum and take up this office. I'm going to hire a mob, an armed mob. They're going to surround his house. His house is fortified because he knows what's going to happen. We're going to surround his house. We're going to keep him in there for a year until the next election, when we'll get one of my buddies in instead. And they do this. They lay siege to his house. And there's these running battles in the streets going on everywhere. Actually, did any of you see the HBO series, Rome? Oh, okay, so we got at least one take. You got to watch this. It's great for understanding the way all this stuff works. So this seems to be quite a common pattern. That it's like violence is violence, and it kind of bleeds out from one context to another. And I think particularly perhaps bleeds down from the interstate wars into the civil society. And yeah, and I guess you're never given much thought to what you were saying about it sort of spiking up when the young men who've gotten used to being violent come home from the wars. That would be interesting to see if that applies to other contexts too. So yeah, thank you for the question. Gosh, because I haven't had any questions from over here. Yeah, gentleman here. Oh, oops, we're being cut off.
A day or two ago, the Wall Street Journal had an article essentially saying that radical Islam and Al Qaeda, et cetera, is taking Iraq back. So, what, with all of your research, what light can you throw on our battle with Islam and its battle with us infidels?
Yeah, so the question was basically about the recent US struggles in the Islamic world. And a gentleman was saying there's a piece in the Wall Street Journal a couple of days ago about how radical Islamists are kind of moving back into Iraq, becoming more and more influential there. And of course, I'm sure you've all heard about the recent drone strikes in Yemen and all the things going on there. So where I think you're asking, where does all that stuff fit into this bigger story? Yeah, this is something, again, I got very interested in this as I was writing the book, because it seemed to me that once again, what we've been dealing with since 2001, this is not a new phenomenon at all. And it's paralleled, another of the alarming parallels, I think, between the situation the US is in now and the kind of place the British Empire found itself in the late 19th century. Because I think in both of these situations, what you get is you get one great power, which got the military muscle, the naval muscle in particular for the British, and also the financial muscle that just makes going to war a little bit scary for other governments. And so say you're back in the 1860s when the American Civil War is going on. Abraham Lincoln's worst nightmare is that the British are going to recognize the South. Because if they do that, then just everything falls apart immediately. He's terrified of what the British might do in this war, but the British decided this war is probably the right thing to happen. They're going to just stay out of it. And I think very similar situations back in the 1860s and again now in the 2000s, 2010s. And what you get in both cases, you get this great decline in the number of big interstate wars and a great surge in the number and visibility of these asymmetrical wars against basically insurgent groups. And what makes it, I think, particularly kind of creepy and unsettling is that in both cases, the major conflicts between the Globocop and insurgents are against Islamists in exactly the same parts of the world, from basically Central Africa on an arc through to Central Asia. And the British find themselves fighting. There's a guy in Sudan who in the 1880s rebels against the Egyptian rule of Sudan and sets up an Islamist caliphate there. The British call him the Mad Mahdi. They don't like him. He sets up an Islamist caliphate there. And the British eventually invade Sudan in 1898. They win the Battle of Omdurman, overthrow the Mad Mahdi. They end up being in Sudan till 1956 to prevent this from happening again. They're fighting similar wars in northern India, in Afghanistan, in Iran. It's kind of creepy how similar the thing is. And I guess I would say the explanation here is that when you you get this big scary Globocop, and the other great powers, the Russians, the Germans, whoever it is, they don't want to get tangling with the Globocop. They figure using force won't solve our problems. But the sort of the little players, the small players, the Mad Mahdi's, the Osama bin Ladens, they say, hey, force can still pay off for me. I mean, and of course, bin Laden's big idea seems to have been that if he hurts America badly enough, he'll drag it into all these wars, which will turn the whole Islamic world against it, and the US won't be able to afford these wars, it'll go bankrupt. So he figures he's got a strategy that by using force, he can get what he wants. And that, it's just uncannily like a lot of these 19th century things. But then these 19th century counterinsurgency wars, and actually it's the British guys fighting those write the original manuals on counterinsurgency that then get rediscovered in the last 10 years. These wars all of a sudden lose their visibility when you get to the point that suddenly people are saying, well, this is all, we hate having to fight all the time in India, but oh my God, look at the Germans. And I suspect we're going to see something a little bit similar if the scary predictions about China start coming true, and we do find ourselves tangling with a near-peer rival, that all of a sudden everybody's going to start forgetting about the Islamists. But that's just a guess, obviously. Who knows what's going to happen? Gentleman over in the back right.
Thanks. Your comments about Hobbs and Pinker raise a point that I think we ought to hear you out directly on.
Ah.
Both thought, but although peace is a complicated thing, the end of war is a complicated thing, that it is critical to drive religion out of politics to accomplish it. Pinker has been very clear about this. He's made very scandalous comments, in particular about theistic religion. But he's also been saying it's not just about theistic religion, it's about religious impulses that can lead to things like Hitler and Stalin, who may be atheists, but he still sees the religious impulse and its decline as critical to peace. I was wondering if you think he's right.
Oh, wow, okay. There's sort of a standard rule in public speaking that when you get to the last or the last but one question, they're always the ones that get you. You end up saying something that the next day you wake up and think, oh boy, I wish I hadn't said that. But yeah, so if there's one thing that can get audiences more riled up than a talk about how war has actually had some good effects, it's talking about religion. But on this one, I mean, I don't completely agree with what Pinker is saying. And I think you're quite right as well, because this is part of Hobbes' thing too, about the terrible effects of religion in war, which he saw very clearly in the English Civil War, because at least indirectly, so much of that was about more radical forms of Protestantism and the English fear that Catholicism was creeping back into the country, which actually turned out to be completely true. So religion very large in Hobbes' thinking too. And I mean, one of the reasons this gets to be so contentious these days is, as again, I'm sure many of you know, there's been this sort of intellectual movement over, pretty recent, really over the last 10 years. People will often call the new atheism. And it's guys like Richard Dawkins and to some extent Pinker and Daniel Dennett and a bunch of other people saying that religion is basically the most dangerous force in the world. And it's corrupted humanity. It's led to this massive waste of resources. It's just a terrible, terrible thing. And yet one of the things they do sometimes say is that if we could get everybody to stop believing in gods, then the world will become a much safer place. And I guess my thinking on this, you've been driven very much by trying to look at history as a very big story. And I guess increasingly I've come to feel that, this is such a wishy-washy response, but it depends. It depends on what, terrible answer. Depends on what else is going on. And so I think in ages where you get these leviathans starting to form, these Globocops, they're driving down the rates of violent death, I think on the whole, I mean, because it varies hugely, but on the whole in those ages, I think religion tends to be a very positive force. Like say you look at the Roman Empire, again, one of my favorite examples for thinking about these things. Roman Empire, starting 2nd, 3rd centuries AD, becomes more and more Christianized, and Christianity, at least initially, plays this big role in pacification. And I think as the Europeans start expanding out over the world, the Christian church gets a lot of bad press, but particularly in the New World, I think that the church did do quite a lot to restrain some of the worst instincts of the European conquerors. But then you look at other periods, like say this medieval period of the spike in rates of violent death. And again, huge variety. But my impression is that on the whole, religion tends to have the opposite effect. That when stuff is falling apart and the world is getting more violent, then you start getting people more and more using religion as a justification for using force. I mean, I think that's always there. If you believe strongly enough that you are absolutely right about everything, then, of course, I think that does justify using almost any ends to get what you think is right. But I think it tends to be worse in the periods when the states are falling apart, violence is going up. You know, the Middle Ages, of course, this is when we get the Crusades. And I think this is not a coincidence. So this is something I've actually only started thinking about this recently, which you can probably tell from the way I'm kind of waffling around here in my response. But I think that this is really interesting. Maybe one day I will decide that not enough people hate me yet and I need to write a book about religion too. So do we have time for any more? Or? One more. Okay, gentleman in the second to last row.
I think that if we did a different job in education around the world, our history books are talking more about war than it does about peace. If we talk more about parameters and the different people ahead and different people try to stop the wars and dealing with a different perspective on war instead of the way we just cram war down all in education. Do you think that would help?
Yeah, a good question. I mean, the question is about education, basically. And if we had education systems that emphasized peace more, and again, correct me if I'm mangling your question, but so emphasize peace more than war, will this help us have a more peaceful world? And I think the answer is clearly yes. And I think this has been happening over the last 50 years. Like, I teach at Stanford and part of the history programs and stuff. And if you look at the typical history department in a US university 50 years ago, awful lot of the faculty there, they'll be specialists on wars, the American Civil War, World War II, whatever. You look now, almost nobody is. Our history department at Stanford, we have no faculty whose primary area of expertise is war. I think there's been this dramatic change in this. And I think this is a big factor in contributing to a kind of pacification, this sense that war is not the answer to problems. But what I would also say on that is we have to ask, well, why has that happened? And I think the reason it's happened is that basically, obviously I would think this, but because of the processes I was talking about here, that as you get the more and more powerful leviathans pacifying their societies, the education systems start moving in the same direction. I think they are the kind of the secondary variable here rather than the prime mover. And I think, again, it's informative to look back through history at how this has gone in earlier times. You look back to the Roman Empire, you find something a little bit similar, that it starts to get, by the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, it begins to get a little bit unfashionable. You're uncool if all you talk about all the time is the great military deeds of your family. And people will actually say this in some of the letters that aristocrats write to each other, that you should talk a little bit more about some of the fine books that were written by your ancestors and not so much about the number of people he beheaded. And so I think that this is something you see. And of course, you look at the Middle Ages, again, by comparison, it's like, whoa, no, you talk about how many people you behead. That's what you talk about. So again, I think I would put this in this category with the soft power more generally. I think it is really important, but it only starts to become important when the world has been pacified to a pretty remarkable extent already. So, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
The book is for sale. There's no conflict about what a great talk that was.
Well, thank you very much.